And I kind of look at it that what is Paul really saying to Timothy at that point? Okay. But one of the things that we need to understand is that when you are making reference to the end times, most of the time people think end times are dealing with just today. Okay. But the end time actually started, biblical end time actually started when Jesus came. Okay. Those are the last days. This is why in the past God spoke through the prophets, but in these last days, God speaks through his Son. Those last days began in the time that Jesus came. Okay, so theologically speaking, the last days began 2,000 years ago. Okay, and many of the writers, and even Jesus, when he commented on the last days, he was making reference to events that were happening even then. When Paul told Timothy, these are the last days, he's not saying, Timothy, I want you to look into the future and these are the last days. He's actually telling Timothy that the days that they're living in were the last days. Okay. Now the last of the last is a different thing. One of the biggest problems that we have is trying to make sense, okay, of the fact that these are the last days and living in the last days with living with the not yet. Okay. The not yet, these are the last days that we're living in, but the not yet is still there. Okay. And trying to reconcile living that way can create some type of a paradox in you, and it can bring some confusion. But the truth is that we are living in the end times, but the not yet tells me that I don't know when the end of the end of the end is going to be. Okay, and that. But the last days, we've been living them out for 2,000 years now. Okay, and that. And again, with the understanding that with the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years anyway. Okay, so when we refer to the last days, we can be referring to 2 days or 3 days. Okay, so you can be referring to 2,000 years or 3,000 years in God's economy. It can become kind of confusing. Plus, when you start looking at the events of the last days, now that is entirely different. Those can become very confusing times to reconcile what the Bible says concerning the last days and what we're seeing today, what we're hearing today. It can be very confusing. Okay, one of the basis for people believing that there's a big revival yet coming is Joel's prophecy concerning the last days. Okay, that I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh. Okay, and so they take that as to mean that before the coming of the Lord, okay, that God's going to pour out his spirit and there's going to be this massive revival. But if I keep it in the context of the last days being around since Jesus left, okay, or since Jesus was here, that event already took place. Okay, and even Peter, in describing the day of Pentecost, says this is that which the prophet Joel spoke about, that in the last days. So for the last days, the last 2,000 years, God has been pouring out his spirit. Okay, so it's not that it's an event that's going to take place prior, because this is where the confusion it comes in. Because again, if we see the description of the last days, and you're trying to reconcile some type of big revival prior to Jesus coming the second time, it doesn't fit what the Bible talks about. The events leading up to the last days. Do we need a revival? Yes, we need a revival, but it doesn't fit. Okay? The church needs to wake up. The church is asleep. The church is not wanting sound doctrine. The church is full of lawlessness or sin that has come into the camp. And it describes the love of God has been grown cold. It describes, something entirely different than a revival. So, yes, we need a revival, but it's a revival of repentance is what God is calling us to. He's calling us to repent in the last days, or the last of the last days. But again, the pouring out of the Spirit, Peter already dealt with that on the day of Pentecost, and he said that this event, this thing is for you, for your children, and as many as the Lord would call. So for the last 2,000 years, God has been wanting to pour out his Spirit, okay? The church has been its biggest enemy sometimes as the church went into dark ages and not relying on the Spirit of God, and then all of a sudden the Spirit of God was poured out again, and then people became receptive to it. And my fear today is that now we've turned it all back into a religion again, okay? And that which then coincides with the events of the last days, okay? Now the other thing too is that...
Question. So the statement that when they said the early rain and the latter rain, explain that.
Well, again, in America, we don't have that concept like we do in other areas of the world, okay, where you take, and now this is where I'm going to throw a twist on this one, because here's the thing. To really understand the early rains, it's just what it speaks. It's the early rains.
I got them mixed up.
Okay? It's the early rains. The early rains will come in, okay, to prepare the soil, okay? Then the latter rains come in, okay? And so what happens is the latter rains comes in and it brings the fruit into a ripe situation ready to harvest, okay? But then what follows that? That follows the latter rain, you harvest, okay? Because here's the other thing now. When you look at the cycle of early and latter rain, okay, when you look at the cycle of it, you're going to run into a problem, okay? And this is the problem. You got early rain, latter rain. So the early rains come, and in a lot of nations, this is where, again, where the Bible talks about cast your bread upon the water, okay? When the early rains come, it flooded. But as it settled, it created a good environment for seeds to take root, okay? And what they would do, some seeds just throw them on the water, and when it subsides and it goes down, it gets into the soil. And it's got a good bed for fertilization, and the seed starts growing, and it becomes, what it does. Then later on, when it starts maturing and the fruit is on the vine and everything's ready to go, then you have another rain that comes in and helps it ripens. Once that is ripe, then you got to do something. You got to harvest. Because if you don't harvest, there's another rain coming. It's called the early rains again. The early rains flood. So what you did harvest just got swept away in a flood. Okay? Now, if we don't understand that whole concept in America, we use it more of a spiritual, early rains, latter rains, and all of this stuff, okay? The latter rain, and we used to call it, back at the turn of the century, or not this century, the last century, we called it the latter rain movement, okay? The Spirit was poured out. The church came into fruition. The only thing that's left now is the harvesting. Who's going to do the harvesting? The harvesting, the angels are going to do it. When they come and get us. When Jesus comes, that's the harvesting. Okay? That is the harvesting. Because if you don't have that, okay, if you don't have that that harvesting, anything that's not harvested is going to get washed away. And the early rains becomes a fertile ground for new growth later. But initially, it destroys everything that's left behind. Okay, now that fits more, and I know people want to argue this point, but let me tell you this. Again, it fits more the narrative of what's going to happen. You had the latter rains that came, okay, the early rains that came. Then you have the latter rain, which the early rains came when Jesus was here, and right after the Spirit of God was poured out initially. The latter rains came at the turn of the 1900s, and now the harvesting has to take place. Okay? If whatever's left, something's going to happen. What's going to happen? There's going to be another rain. The early rain is going to become the rain of judgment. Who's going to pour that rain out? God himself is pouring it out through Jesus Christ. He's pouring out another rain. Now, once that judgment is done, it ushers in the millennial. A time of fruitfulness. A time, you see, that fits right together. People don't want to look at that, because people somehow, they just want to live on this planet forever, and I'm not here forever. You know, judgment is coming. And sooner or later, you got to get off of this early rain, latter rain, early rain, latter rain, and say, okay, when is judgment in the middle of all this? Well, what happened is that the church missed out that the early rains are also rains of judgment. Okay? Here's the problem. I don't go around declaring to be a prophet, but I think I hit it on more than most people realize. Okay? And when the first time that it rained on earth, what was that?
Judgment.
When the flood, what was that?
Judgment.
Judgment. Early rains brings about judgment, but it prepares the soil for new life. Early rains came 2,000 years ago. Latter rains came less than 1,000 years, or about 1,000, more than 1,000 years ago now, or 100 years ago. I should say not 1,000 years ago, 100 years ago. You harvest, or it gets lost. That which remains is going to get caught up in the rains of judgment. But that judgment, when it settles, leads into new life, which we know today is going to be the millennial reign of Christ. Okay? And that people can argue all they want. But you know what? I look at it this way. We'll see. Okay. We're not here to bring division. I'm just here to look at the scriptures the way they present themselves. And I know enough about how early and latter rains work because I've been to other countries. Okay. Seeing how they work. You know. Some countries, that's all they get is early rains and latter rains. They don't get anything in between. That little bit of drizzling that they get once in a while means absolutely nothing. Okay? And that our country here, you know, we get saturated. A couple of days ago we were saturated. Wait another week, get saturated again. You know, but again, when you're looking at that concept of early rains and latter rains, you got to again keep it in the context of the Bible. And the biblical concept of it. And when my argument is that the first rains that ever came here on earth was the rain of judgment that was followed by new life, a new opportunity, new growth. That was Noah. Okay. But again, you had then another rain that came. Okay. And that. But when you get into this concept of the early rains, the latter rains, okay, each one plays their part. Okay. And I'm looking at the latter rains. We've been living in that for the last 100 years. But unfortunately, you better harvest. Because if you don't, the next rains are coming, are going to judge it. Okay? You don't want to lose your crop. God doesn't want to lose his. Okay? So he harvested before the rains of judgment comes. Okay? So that's where, to answer your question, and that. But again, when you start looking at the end times and eschatology, there's just so much that we don't know, and that's where the not yet part comes in. We don't know the exact time. We don't know the exact date. There's a lot of unknowns. But we do know the signs, okay? Or we should know the signs, okay? Again, another thing that you have to understand is this, that when you're referring to the last days and you're looking at, as Christians, we look at the last days and we somehow say the last days and say rapture, the same thing. That's not the same thing, okay? Biblically speaking, the rapture is an event by itself. The sudden disappearance of people from all over the world, that's an event by itself. Biblically speaking, when a Bible is talking about the last days, or the second coming, I should say, it is actually referring to not the rapture, but it's referring to the time when Jesus actually comes on this earth, okay? And that when he touches down on the Mount of Olives, when he sets up his millennial kingdom, but again, when he touches down the Mount of Olives, he's bringing judgment with him. But prior to that, he's already been pouring out the judgment. That's the beautiful thing about it. We see a picture of him in heaven pouring out judgment upon this world, and just when about the end of it, the way it's going to end it is that the person who actually been pouring out the judgment comes down again and puts an end to it. Okay? He's poured out his judgment, and then when he comes down, and he's going to put an end to all of this nonsense, and he's going to set up his kingdom. That is when we're referring to the second coming. Okay? But as Christians, a lot of times we like to refer to the second coming as the time when he comes for the rapture. Biblically speaking, that's not necessarily correct. Even though some may say, well, you're straining a camel or whatever, straining a gnat, swallow the camel stuff. No, biblically speaking, no, it's not. It is when he is here, okay? And that the whole concept of the rapture, we like to think that it was something that everybody understood, okay? And again, without getting into a lot of detail, it was an Irish lawyer who actually wrote this whole concept based out of Thessalonians, that today we know as the rapture, the events, the events leading up to it. He was not a theologian, but he kind of had his head on straight. And it became what we call today modern dispensational, okay, or dispensationalism. This is what, this was actually Derby was his name. He was Irish, 1800s, and it created a situation where the church now considers it viable, okay, but more than that, it's became an opportunity for the church to, instead of being united, actually became a time for division. Because right away, people not understanding the whole concept of what he was writing, that people want to explain the unexplainable. And there's just certain things you're not going to explain. Like I said, we're in the last days, but we're not. The what not is, I don't know the day. I don't know when the day, the last day of the last day of the last day is going to be. All I do know is that Peter both spoke about the last days of being in his time. Okay? Paul, writing to Timothy, he tells him these are the last days, okay, in his time, okay, and that because we have been in those last days, and you have to kind of keep it with that frame of mind that we are and have been in the last days for a couple thousand years, okay, and that so one of the things that we gave you then was those definitions so that you can understand what I call 10-cent words instead of penny words. People are afraid of words, and you should never be afraid of words. You shouldn't be afraid of anything like that. Words become important. Okay, when you begin to describe something, try to describe something without words, you're dead in the water. Okay. So we went through that, and then we were kind of going too slow through that. So I just said, why don't you just take some time and you go over it and read it. And again, you have to get familiar with these words. Okay. So when you hear them, it's not something, we don't need ologies, Well, if you don't have the right theology, you're in trouble anyway. Okay. And if you don't have the right theology, all your other ologies are probably going to be wrong anyway, so it doesn't really matter at that point. So, eschatology is just dealing with the end times, the events, the final destiny of man, and so when we start looking at Christian eschatology, it is what the Bible says, okay? And I'm one, as I studied theology, I come to the conclusion that since there's only one God, okay, the only true theology out there is going to be Christian theology. For me to deny that, then it would be putting question marks all over mine. I can get into a debate with people concerning Christian theology versus Muslim theology, a Mormon theology, okay, the theology of Buddha and all of these other teachings that are out there. But since there's only one God, okay, and that God chose to reveal himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the only theology that I'm concerned about is that theology concerning this God, okay? Everything else, and in my mind, there can't be two absolutes, there can't be two sovereigns, there cannot be two almighties. It's an impossibility. So there's only one God, and I look at life through that lens, and the only thing that I know about God is what he revealed about himself, just like the only thing you can know about me is what I revealed about me. You can't know any more than that. Now you can see through my actions, you can see through my words, okay, and you can, my own definition of who I am, how I describe myself, okay. That's all you're going to learn about me, and the same thing with God. The only thing we're going to know about God is what he says about himself, okay, how he reveals himself, how the actions that he does speak loud, okay. So again, when we look at theology, I'm looking at Christian theology as the only theology out there, okay. Everything else to me is false, okay, and I will not allow myself to bend any other way. But I school myself into being able to argue my point. And that doesn't mean I become argumentative. It means that I'm able to defend it. Okay? Apologetics is being able to defend one's position. Okay? And so we need to all have proper theology. And if we want to apply our ability to defend it. And most people, unfortunately, have no defense. They believe whatever the pastor says, they believe whatever they hear, and I'm not sure where conviction is anymore, because the conviction that should be there is not there anymore. My conviction will not allow me to see another God. I'm sorry. My conviction does not allow me to move in any other direction, but I will defend my position. Okay? Biblically, historically, however way you want to defend it. Scientifically, you want to defend it, let's go. It's the ability to defend. That's what apologetics is all about. But when we're dealing with the end times, what, you know, that's a big word, eschatology, but when we just experienced here recently what the Mayans had to say about the end times, or what we thought the Mayans had to say about the end times, you know, and we went through this Mayan scare, as it were. And my concern, even with that, we became so caught up on 2012 with this Mayan, and even people in the church was caught up into that. And it's like, shame on us. What does the Mayan religion have to do with Christianity? Absolutely nothing. And we get so caught up on that 2012. I couldn't believe how the church was. What's that?
4 minutes. 4 minutes.
Oh, 4 minutes. You know, I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. Okay? And the fear that was coming on people. If we had that type of approach to proper eschatology, what the Bible has to say, we'd be more ready. Unfortunately, we were more concerned with what the Mayans had to say. I could give a rat's butt concerning what the Mayans had to say because it's a false religion. Okay? So by adding to it and saying, you know, believing in this 2012, you know, what I was doing is adding credence to a false religion. I mean, come on. We are so concerned about the end of the world through the lens of the world rather than through the lens of God. Our church didn't put one bottle of water up in the year 2000. We didn't have one can of beans. Because I told my people, I says, my faith is not on a calendar. My faith is not on a computer. My faith is in Jesus Christ. And we're showing fear here. And we didn't put anything away. Now the science side of me was saying, go ahead and get those milk jugs and fill them full of water and see how long it's going to last you before bacteria starts forming in those things. Okay? And that. Go ahead and do whatever you want to do. Prepare yourself. Fall for all these people selling you stuff, you know. But we didn't do anything like that. We just went ahead and said, you know what? I'm going to go to sleep, and when I wake up, it's going to be the next year, and ain't nothing going to happen. And you know what happened? Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing.
Yep.
But the fear of it all, our inabilities for our computers to be able to adjust to the new millennial. Oh, I'm sorry. Those that know me, I wouldn't fall for that nonsense at all. I'm sorry. And that, you know, I'm sorry. It just doesn't. You have to stay biblical. You either believe what you believe or you don't. This is why I'm having trouble even today. Church has to eventually rise up and take a stand, because you're falling for nonsense at this point. Bottom line is, we're all going to go, we're old, and we're all going to die. Okay? We're all going to die, and we're all going to grow old, you know, and no virus is going to take you unless the Lord. See, my theology says that Jesus has the keys of life and death. People may argue that point and say, well, but you still can't tempt God. I'm not tempting God. I'm just putting the right thing. Life and death is in his hands, not anything else. And if it's my time to die, it may be that virus or it may be something else. So you know what? Live with it. Okay?